Alright, hello and welcome to another Marvel Snap video. Thought I'd do a little bit of a different one today. Instead of a deck highlight, I'm just going to make a tier list of all the 2-cost cards in the game. I did a 1-cost card a few months ago, probably close to a year at this point, and I thought, why not try it again with 2 drops? So I tried to compile all of them here. It's a little tricky because this gets updated regularly, but the cards never get updated. So like, for example, Angel is now at 2-3. He's still listed as his initial release value, so that's how they all are. So it's a little complicated, but I think I have them all. If I missed one or two, apologies. I tried my best. Um, but yeah, so I guess before I get started, in the comments, let me know what your favorite card is or what you think the best card is, and see if we line up at the end. Also, if you want to see more of this kind of stuff, let me know and I can try to make more of this happen. But yeah, so generally the thought is S tier cards are going to be either cards that are a staple to their niche archetype, if they're a very specific archetype card, or a card that's just generically good in everything, like you can just kind of always play it and it's always a good option to have in the deck. And then cascading downward, so the B and C tier are probably going to be pretty cluttered since they're just kind of the average cards, and I think there's a lot of average 2-drops. But yeah, so we can get into it with Angel. I think since Angel became a 2-drop, he's better, certainly better than he was as a 1-drop. He became immune to Killmonger and he gained a point of power, so he's a 2-3, right? But he's still not a great card. I probably would have put him in the D or F tier when he was a 1-drop, but now I'm putting him in the C. He's a little bit better, he's just nothing great. Armor is either a high B tier card or a low A tier card, in my opinion. It's a very versatile card. It's a very good tech option that shuts down, obviously, destroy decks or any destroy tech cards like Shang or Lady Deathstrike or Killmonger. So it's very good to have. On top of that, you have good synergies with ongoing decks, so you can use like Spectrum to really buff up that card even more. So it's a very versatile card, just nothing too crazy. It's a 2-3, so you're getting decent stat value and a good effect. It's just not going to be too crazy. Baron Mordo, I don't know why this is lagging so much. He's bad, very bad card. He is, even after the rework that he had a while ago, now he just sets the top card of your opponent's deck to 6. It's just not very good. It also goes away on turn 6, which I think it should have just stayed the whole time. Like, it still wouldn't make an impact. It's just not a very good effect, and his stats don't reflect it being not a very good card. So yeah, very bad card. Angela, I think she is an A tier card right now. I know she isn't very prominent right now, so probably a low A tier. But even since she became a 2-3, she can still get a lot of points of power in decks that run Angela well. She's still typically a 2-8, 2-9, so she's still a very strong card. That gives a lot of power, that can win you a lane a lot of the times. Bucky's another one similar to Angel. He's a 2-6 once he gets destroyed. He's good destroy bait for cards like Carnage, Deathlock, Venom. So it just, feeds death, feeds your null, and then you get a 2-6 body afterward. It's pretty good stat line. If this is year 1 of Marvel Snap, he's maybe an S tier card because 2-6s were unheard of. Now with the rising in power of other cards, he's not as good as he once was. Still good, but not great. um, which I think is a good B tier card. Cable is another okay card. 2/3 that steals a card from your opponent's deck. It's an okay effect. His stats is, average for what the ability is. Pretty much only going to see him in mill and maybe like a collector Quinjet deck. But otherwise, you're not really going to see a whole lot of Cable outside of that. He's kind of niche card, so C tier makes sense. Carnage is going to be an A tier card for me. Very essential destroy card. The only 2-cost destroy card in the destroy archetype, right? Deathlock, Venom, and then Carnage. The other 2 are 3-drops. Carnage being a 2/8 that also enables a lot of other things, like I said, Bucky Barnes, Deadpool, Wolverine, just a lot of very good cards that he is able to synergize with. And on top of that, after you do all that enabling, you end up with a 2/6 to 2/8 for very low effort. It's a very strong card. Cloak is an interesting effect because she's a 2/4, so she has a very good stat line, distinctly on rate when you have 2 power for every energy. The effect of being able to move any card to this location, the downside being both players can move cards. It gets tricky because when you do like a Cloak on turn 5, it's effectively a New York effect, so it makes end games very hazy. If you use the card properly, it's a very strong card, but I think a lot of the times maybe your opponent is capable of using that card better than you are in some cases, which makes it a little bit harder to use, so stays low in the B tier. Calling me? Hello? Ah! My thing's lagging. Colleen Wing, I'm also going to put in the B tier, but higher up in the B tier. Colleen Wing discards the lowest cost card from your hand, which is really good for hitting something like Swarm or a Wolverine or X-23 if you're running those in your deck, but most importantly, hitting a Swarm, being able to get consistently free Swarms and targeted discard at a 2/4 body, which is very good. It's a very strong discard and a card that I personally run in most of my Apocalypse discard decks, so I think it's very good. Dagger, I'm also going to put in the A tier. Contrary to what her text says, she's a 2/0 that gets +3 power for each opposing card at the location she moves to. So even with just one move, you can get her to a 2/6, 2/9, 2/12 in some cases. And then if you're moving her multiple times, then you're going to have... It's not uncommon to see Dagger at a 220 stat line. Thing preventing her from being S tier is obviously move isn't very good. Even after all of the additional cards, it's not a great archetype. And it's easily counterable by things like Shang and specifically Shadow King, since her base is 0. If you Shadow King it, it's effectively a dead card in the lane. So all your opponent has to do is know where you plan to end it, and it's a useless card. But the same can be said about Angela and Carnage, and they're still up here. So next is Colossus. He is a 2/3 that can't be destroyed or have his power reduced. Pretty much only seen in Spectrum ongoing decks, and even at that, he's seen at low collection level versions of those decks. His main draw is that you can get him in hard to reach locations like Death's Domain, Altar of Death. You can play him early into something like Jotunheim, Negative Zone, where he'll still have his 3 power, which can be impactful, but generally not a super played card. I think if he maybe got a point of power, he might see a little bit more play in those decks, but not really a whole lot. Daredevil is another card to me. He lets you see your opponent's turn 5 play before they do it, letting you kind of react to what they're gonna do. It's an okay effect. A lot of the times, the issue with the card is it's bad tempo, right? You're playing 2 power on turn 2 to learn what your opponent's doing on turn 5. So unless you have a really good answer to what a lot of turn 5 plays are, it's not gonna really do that much for you. Which is why you don't even see him really in a lot of decks. Domino is an interesting one. I'm gonna put her in the D tier. She is pretty bad. I can't tell you like the exact math, but generally it's bad draw odds. You are guaranteed to pull her on turn 2, which means you have worse odds to draw other cards that you want later in the game. You have an increased odd to draw cards you want on turn 1, but worse every other turn after turn 2. The only benefit to Domino is if you're running Wiccan, you have better odds to perform Wiccan, but then at that point there's other cards, Hawkeye, that will, Kate Bishop specifically, that does this job better, which is why Domino isn't really that highly rated. Yeah, also I didn't really think about these cards much beforehand, so I'm kind of doing it on the fly. Falcon. I guess I have Mr. Sinister. So we'll do Mr. Sinister. I'll put Mr. Sinister in the middle of the C tier. I think he's a distinctly average card. He's good right now, actually. A lot of boost decks, like decks that do like hand buffing with like Nakia, Gwenpool, Fastos is deck buffing, the same idea, Okoye, are using him, Brood, Absorbing Man, so he is getting some decent play right now, but generally he's not anything to write home about outside of the niche decks that he's okay in. He's not even that great because you'd rather have Brood than Mr. Sinister like every single time. But he is, if you're able to buff him, he can be very good value. It's just very specific use cases, which is why he's nothing above. Falcon is an interesting one. I'm a little torn. I could see him being a low A tier or like a high B tier card. I think I'm going to put him in the low A tier. In Bounce, he is an extremely key card, especially with the recent buff rework to Black Swan, however you want to look at it. Falcon is in some scenarios better than Beast, since you can pair it with Black Swan and get all of your 1-drops picked back up and make them free. Yeah, I mean, just a very good bounce card. And here's where my mild bias comes in. I love Goose. I think Goose is a very good lane control card, and a card that currently in the meta is pretty good. It's good into like every deck you want it to be good into, except for like Hela. It's not great into Hela since Hela just plays cards randomly. But outside of that, a lot of decks right now are playing a decent amount of 4, 5s, and 6 costs. So Goose is able to shut those down. So decks that are running smaller cost cards, like something like Silver Surfer or Mill, I can't think of ongoing decks where you'd be running a War Machine or something. Goose is a very good card to make it difficult for your opponent to win that lane and make it relatively easy for you to know how to play under it. I think I personally win a lot of games using Goose. I think she's an underrated card. Yeah, I think A tier makes sense in my opinion. Forge is good, not great. I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't think there's gonna be a lot of S tier cards. I got like maybe 2 that I can think of. But yeah, Forge is a good card. Mainly only seen in Destroy. Like I said, the hand buff stuff is kind of coming into play, where Forge is seeing some more play. You can buff like Broods to get like, you know, a 320 that, so you have 3 of them. Outside of that, it's mainly Destroy, which he's good. He has a small body, which means he's very good for something like Carnage to destroy, where you're effectively gaining power from having him killed. And then you'd forge something like a Deadpool, where you're making him a 1/3 destroyed into a 1/6. So a very good card. He's a 2/2 right now. He's not 2/1. But yeah, he's just a generically good card that you can kind of slot into a lot of decks, but he's also not a make or break card. He's not typically winning you a game. He's just good to have in a deck, which is why I don't think he's any higher than B. Hazmat, I'd say is high C, maybe a low B tier card. At the end, I'm gonna re-look over everything and see if I want to shuffle anything, but I'm put her at the top of C for now. Obviously, her use case is very niche, affecting negative cards on both sides of the board. You have to be prepared for how you want to deal with that, but if you're able to utilize it well, like in a negative high evo deck or any kind of Ajax deck, junk decks, she can single-handedly win you the game. It's just you have to build very carefully around her, and then you also need good card pulls, which is why I don't know that she's necessarily higher than like a low B tier card, where it's just like, okay, I think she's probably an average card because of how much work you have to put in to make her good. Invisible Woman, I'm gonna move her into the D tier as well. I think she's a bad card, especially with like the Eliath change, right? He just instantly melts anything behind it. On top of that, the Hell Cow rework to being an activate makes it so you don't need Invisible Woman in Hella anymore. So the only deck that you might see Invisible Woman in is Living Tribunal, but even they don't run it because it would be safer and better to just put it behind a Cosmo at that point. She doesn't really serve much of a purpose, really. I don't know that I see her in any decks. The only good thing is she can protect from like an Enchantress, but like I said, at that point, just Cosmo. Like anything she does, Cosmo does better. Kraven just got a point of power, and yeah, I think he's probably a distinctly average card, probably a B tier 2-drop. He's a card you put into every move deck probably. The issue is he just never really scales the way that you would hope he would, especially with Angela being the exact same cost. You would hope that Kraven would scale the same way that Angela does, and it just doesn't work out that way. Any game that you can get Kraven to like a 2/8, you're feeling good, whereas Angela, a lot of times that's a bad game for her. I was honestly hopeful in the OTA that they were going to make it so he gained 3 power for every card that moved in instead of the +2 he gains right now. I think that would have probably pushed him into the A tier, but right now I think he's just a good B tier card. Run him in move, but he's not going to win you a game. Lizard is not great right now. He has kind of fell victim to power creep a lot. His downside of being a 2/5 is pretty detrimental. You need to pair him with something like an Enchantress to remove his downside. And generally, almost any other 2/5 or 2/6 would be a better option than Lizard in most decks. It's just kind of the way it is. Master Mold. He's an okay tech card, right? He enables Ronin, but obviously Ronin isn't very good right now. The issue with Master Mold is you're giving your opponent Sentinels to clog their hand, and Sentinels have more power than Master Mold. It doesn't really make sense to me why he gives cards that are better than himself. Obviously it can be frustrating to receive them, but at the end of the day, it's bad tempo and not that disruptive most of the time. Like, they miss out on maybe one draw, which White Widow or Black Widow can do. I think maybe if he gave like dysfunctional Sentinels or something, that they were like 2/1s instead of 2/3s, that could be a good way to make Master Mold better, but maybe that's a lot of effort on their end. Next is Medusa. I actually think Medusa is underrated. She's a 2/5 that her downside is just play her middle. Like, it's a very workable play around, especially, right? Like, Lizard's downside is if the opponent fills a lane, he a 2/1, where it's extremely detrimental, where Medusa's just play the card middle. Like, I think she's a generically good card that you can slot into almost any deck, probably any deck, outside of like Cerebros that aren't Cerebro 5. Like, you can slot in Medusa and you can be happy that you have a 2/5 that you can just play whenever and get good value out of. Like, I think that she probably should be played more than she is. Mojo is another interesting one. I'm going to put him low B tier for now. Mojo is a good ongoing card, especially when you pair it with cards like Jean Grey or any kind of lockdown that forces your opponent to play into specific lanes. You generally see Mojo in Spectrum ongoing decks, which is why you typically see it paired with Jean Grey, forces your opponent to fill a location. Because if you can activate Mojo at a 2/8, he is the best in class. Relatively, he's one of the best in class power cards. But his activated condition is just very difficult since you also need your opponent to do specific things. Now looking to Morbius. Morbius is one of, if not the best discard card in the game. Top 3 for sure. He's a 2-drop that on a bad day is a 2/10, on a good day can be like a 2/30, depending on how you have your discard deck set up. He can single-handedly win you a lane in a lot of discard conditions, and then just let your Dracula win the other one. It's a very good card. The only downside to him is he's an ongoing card, so he can get countered by Rogue, Echo, and Enchantress. But, you know, every good card needs to have tech into it. So White Widow, I'm going to put in S tier. I think she's an amazing card. Even after the nerf, she's still an extremely strong card, and you can see that with how much junk is going around. So I would also say, when I'm looking at these cards, consider using your spotlight caches on some of these. White Widow being out as I'm making this video, you should probably get her if you can. She's a 2/2 that gives a Widow's Bite to your opponent side of the board, and it's -3 power until you fill that location. So not only are you playing a 2/2, which is fine tempo wise, it's obviously a little down tempo, you're cluttering one location in your opponent's side of the board, and you're forcing your opponent to play a lot of cards there, or else White Widow would be a 2/5 effectively. So it can be an extremely disruptive card. And the real good side is you can White Widow into hard to reach locations like Death Domain, Altar of Death, Luke's Bar, locations like that. You can give your opponent the Widow's Bite, which makes it so they can no longer turn off that effect, so you instantly win that location, and in some cases you get a benefit in return. Like in Altar of Death, you would gain energy, which is better than having the 2 stats on your board. She's just extremely strong even after the nerf. Looking at another extremely strong card, you remember all those really strong cards I said in the A tier? Angela, Carnage, and Dagger? Yeah, they all fall victim to Shadow King, who is also a 2-drop. He, in my opinion, is a top 3 tech card in the game. Like, the other 2 would be Red Guardian and Shang, but Shadow King has the best cost. He's easy to play on turn 6 and then play also something big on turn 4, or just Shang on turn 4. Shadow King is just an amazing card. If you don't have him, that's a card you should look out to get, because it beats a lot of the growing decks right now, and a lot of like the niche decks. Like I said, the buff deck is growing in popularity right now, so it just beats all of those. Um, Mysterio is an interesting one. He's not himself great, but he is a very good enabler. He's 2-4, which is a distinctly average stat line. The downside is he takes up 3 spots on downside and plus side. He takes up 3 slots on your board. However, he's the only card in the game that plays multiple cards when you play him. So he plays 3 decoys to the board. All 3 of those decoys count as a card played. So for cards like Sasquatch, Bishop, and Hitmonkey, he counts as 3 cards being played. So Sasquatch would count as 3 discounted, Hitmonkey would count as plus 6 power, and Bishop would gain 3 power from this. On top of that, when you play him, all of the cards are decoys, which means that Mockingbird gets cost discount from it. You can then, of course, use the decoys to do weird things like destroy them. You can Cersei them to change them into useful things. There's a lot you can do, but the board space is kind of a tough one to deal with, I would say, a lot of the time. Losing 3 of your board slots to 2 energy is tough, which is probably why we're not seeing a lot of him right now. He's just not as good as he once was. I think if maybe he regained a point of power, he'd be better. Also, something that people are going to say about Mysterio, you can bast him and then all the decoys would be 3 power. So you would lose the one that's 4 power. You'd lose 1 point of power there, but then you'd gain 3 power on the other 2, which also is a benefit to him. But the decks that utilize all those benefits aren't very good right now, which is why we aren't seeing him right now. But he's still an okay card. Multiple Man is an interesting one to me. And this is kind of where it gets hard to grade things. I would say that he is an average card, because you don't see him in move decks. The only deck you see him in is Phoenix Force decks, which I think is just how good Phoenix Force can be, rather than how good Multiple Man is. He is a very small card, a 2/3, so generally you need to buff him and then start moving him to have him be effect, so it's a lot of effort and generally not very worth it, because you'd rather just grow the other cards like Dagger Vulture or Human Torch rather than Multiple Man. I'm putting Okoye in the D tier. She buffs your deck by giving +1 power, which is not really that good, considering you need to play her on turn 2 to get maximum value, and then you also need to play all of the cards that got hit by her to get her like theoretical value, whereas Nakia at 1 cost higher hits your hand, and you can know that, oh, if I play Nakia, I'm hitting cards that I want, rather than Okoye, I'm playing it knowing I'm hitting these cards in my deck, but I need to draw them at an opportune time to get the benefit. She's just a very clunky card that's not very good, which is why you pretty much only see bots running her. Next is Scarlet Witch. Scarlet Witch is a decent card, probably somewhere in the B tier. Being able to change locations is extremely strong, something that's typically underutilized in Marvel Snap, in my opinion. The big thing is on later turn 6s, you can turn off Limbo. You can change bad locations to make them playable. Like I said, Altar of Death, Luke's Bar, Bar with No Name. You get the idea. So just being able to make that flip to kind of swing games in your favor can be super impactful. But even decks that have like bad location variants against them specifically, like maybe you aren't good into Throne Room, so you can turn off Throne Room to give yourself a better chance. The downside of her is you turn into a random location, so you could change Throne Room into Altar of Death or something, so you can make it even worse for yourself. But she is a good card. Just the randomness kind of keeps her in check. Psylocke is another good card, not great card. You gain +1 energy next turn, and she's a 2/2, so even her body is okay. She's good in Mr. Negative decks. Issue is Mr. Negative decks aren't really that good. But generally it's nice to be able to ramp. She's good in pretty much any ramp deck. She lets you play a 4/2 or a 6 on turn 5, which can be very impactful for some decks. She's generally in pretty much any of those like Electro Blink ramp decks, because you can use Blink or Cersei to kind of flip her down tempo into a positive, so you can Psylocke on 3 and then Blink on 5 or Cersei on 5 to, so not only are you getting a 5-drop out early, you're also getting Psylocke turned into something bigger and more impactful. But she's nothing game breaking, she's just okay. Quake is another one of those okay cards. Similar to Scarlet Witch, she's a niche location manipulating card. However, being able to flip locations around is can be very strong, especially if you pair it with something like Storm. You can flip the flooded location, so if you were once losing it, you're now winning it, and then you lock your opponent out of that location. Locations like Kiln, Nidavellir, where your opponent wants to play a lot of cards into that space, you can ignore it knowing that you're going to flip that tide later on into a different location. It's just, she is very dictated by whether or not you get good locations for it. So if you don't get good flippable locations, she's not a very good card. Sentinel is bad. It's a 2/3 that just puts himself back in your deck, or back in your hand. He's just not a very good card. Not a whole lot to say there. Star-Lord, I think, is a good card. He's a 2/6 that you just need to play him where your opponent also played a card that turn. So yeah, I mean, you can do a lot to kind of guarantee, in air quotes, that your opponent will play a card there. Cards like Nebula, Jean Grey, Storm, right? They're gonna kind of influence where your opponent wants to play cards, so you have a better chance of hitting it. Even that, you can just wait till turn 6 and do kind of like a build your own 6-drop with him, because a 2/6 is very above rate, so you wouldn't complain about getting that. Just, the downside to him is the risk of missing it, and then him being a 2/2 can feel pretty bad. But I'd say generally he's pretty good. Mirage is similar to Cable, which is why she's right next to Cable. I didn't even realize I put her right next to Cable. Similar to Cable, except you get more information of a card that your opponent has in hand, except now you have a bigger version of it, since she draws the lowest cost card, gives it +2 power. Pretty much only see her in collector decks, specifically the Wiccan collector deck that was going around was pretty much the only deck you see Mirage in. She's not great, but she has a similar use to Cable. Athena, I think, is a very good card. She is similar to Angela and is also played in the same decks, except she can tend to grow faster than Angela, and you can use her to kind of win her own lane. You don't need to play cards into Athena, so while you're playing cards into Angela growing her, Athena's also growing on the side. And the nice thing is it kind of splits the attention away from Angela, because you can't Shadow King both of them. And yeah, we haven't seen Athena as much since she got nerfed, but I think that's just because of the decks that are good right now, like Hela and those kind of bigger decks. It's hard for them to necessarily keep up power-wise, but they are still good cards that can beat a lot of the Hela decks that are running around right Um, Pixie, probably an average card. Her effect is too random for her to be good, but when you pair it with Morbius, it can be very good since that negates the downside. But the issue is, since it's a shuffle, you're not guaranteed to even switch the cost off onto other cards. So you can have your deck get shuffled in air quotes, and then all the costs still end up the same, which is not how you build the deck, obviously. Havoc is an extremely bad card since they nerfed Viper to stop being able to flip Havoc to your opponent's side of the board. He's been near unplayable. Sure, he can win you a game, but losing energy is just too detrimental to ever be worth it. So yeah. Zabu, I think, is also a very average card. He has his use cases.
Hyundai Palisade versus Toyota Highlander.
Holy heck!
Look what Palisade has.
I don't know why that happened. But he's, I think, growing a little bit in popularity. People are realizing that you can play him with other 4-drops to get a 4-drop out early. But yeah, he is kind of like Psylocke, except you get more power with him, but your use with him is a little more niche. So I think that's why he's a little bit worse than Psylocke. Madam Web, I was pretty harsh on Madam Web when she first came out, because I was tunnel vision focused on her being in a move deck specifically. I think her strength is not using her explicitly in a move deck, but rather using her as just a tool to move cards around the board. She's very strong in the sense that you can play cards into Madam Web and then know, oh yeah, I want to play this card, but I don't exactly know where I want this card because it depends on where my opponent plays cards. So you can kind of see where your opponent will play things out and then go, okay, I need to move this card here to deal with what they're doing. And I think in that regard, she's a strong card. The issue is being a 2/1, she's just, her body is not very impactful to the game, so you kind of have to deal, you have to be able to negate her down tempo play, which in some cases can be hard to do. Kate Bishop, I think, is a low S tier card. She's not as impactful as the other two, but her curve fill is very strong, and especially the arrows that she can provide are very good. Generally, when you play her, you're gaining at least one card that you will likely play. The acid arrow is extremely strong, and the Hawkeye arrow, the basic arrow, is also very good because it's very easy to get a 1/4 out of it. And on top of that, she is a decent body to go with a good effect. And that's not to mention the fact that she can buff things like Collector and help enable Wiccan, which is why she's up here and Domino is down there. Wolverine, I think, is a very good destroy card. The fact that he is basically unremovable from the board makes him invaluable, and a lot of the times he can end up at like a 2/8, 2/10 kind of stat line and be unkillable. The only thing that can really do anything about him is Shadow King. The only real downside to Wolverine is that it's a random location that he bounces to, but a lot of the times you can get him to end up in those hard to reach locations since you can destroy him 2 to 3 times a game. So, you know, you have a high chance of getting him where you want to go. Next is Valentina. I think I'm going to put her next to all the other 2-cost card generators. She generates a 6 cost at a discounted rate, but also at a lower power. It's proven to be a generally not very good effect. Sometimes you can get that cheap Doctor Doom that's really good, or like a cheap Giganto, but a lot of the times you just end up with a bad 6-drop that has low power. Like you get an Emperor Hulkling and it's like, okay, cool. So generally not very good. Grandmaster is in a similar vein. He has some niche use cases, but generally moving a card and repeating the on reveal isn't that beneficial. So, you know. US Agent, I think, is a above average card. If you're able to play him later after your opponent's already played a 4 or 5 drop, so you can make sure he gets that effect going. He's a 2/7, which is very good. And in some cases where your opponent plays like a lot of big cards, like in Hella, typically Hella players like to play Hell Cow and then play their Hella into Hell Cow. Right, you're getting 2/11, which can be very good and can basically win you a game because you only need to play like one other card to win that lane, and then that frees up all your other energy to win the second location in a game. So he can be good, but he can also feel very unimpactful, and he has a symmetrical effect, so you do need to be careful when looking at that. Dazzler is a good card in decks that you want to fill the board, like Zoo. She's extremely good. And then she also sees a lot of good use case in Patriot decks to help win the Patriot/Ultron lane that you're playing into. Being a 2/8, she matches the best in class. She's probably more like up here. Because she's much better than her Mojo counterpart, who can only be a 2/8 or a 2/2. The nice thing about Dazzler is she scales accordingly, so she's going to typically be a 2/4 to 2/6 in most decks. And has the upside of also being a 2/8 in times. Doctor Strange is a good cheap move card. The issue in my opinion is it can be difficult to utilize properly. If you don't pull any other move cards, he can be clunky and can pull the wrong card. You also have bad location variants, like if you get a monster, it can be difficult to use Doctor Strange until you start moving around a whole lot already. Which is why I'm putting him lower. Maximus is still good, but not as good as he once was. A 2/6 used to be a very good stat line, but now there are a lot of other cards that can kind of do it better and safer, like Star-Lord, and then you have Dazzler that is also a 2/8 at times. Obviously different use case scenarios, but there's just a lot of cards that can kind of match his power or do similar things, but in a safer, less detrimental way because of how bad his ability is. But if you're able to leverage it in decks like Ronin, then it's not that bad. Hulkbuster, I'm going to put him right in front of Forge. He's basically any scenario that you would use Forge, you could also use Hulkbuster to the same effect. The difference being if you get the extra body on the board or not. And Hulkbuster is just one more point of power. Scorpion, I think, is a also good card. If you can play him on 2, you'd hit 4 cards in your opponent's deck, and that can kind of deter your opponents from wanting to play those cards. So it can be a pretty big deal. And then you can view him as a 2/6 or so. Rather than the 2/2 that it says. Swarm, I think, is a extremely good discard card similar to Morbius. Being able to discard him and get free cards that you can then play on the last turn of the game to fill the board, get that extra power on the board, and then you can also still play a big 6 drop. Like if you want to play out your Apocalypse, then you can do that and still play like 2 to 3 swarms in a game, which is extremely strong. Even being just a 0/3 has a lot of impact, but also you can buff him up with things like Gwenpool and Nakia to get some 0/7s on the board, which is just insane. And then the more you discard him, obviously it enables Morbius and can buff Collector up as well, since you get 2 back for every 1 you discard. He's a very strong card in my opinion. I think it's no surprise that Jeff is going in the S tier. Haven't really decided how I want to organize this. I think this is how I want to have the S tier. Jeff is an extremely versatile card. Not being able to be stopped at all is extremely powerful. And then also having the move ability, so you can buff Angela, then move him to another location. You can play him under Professor X, play him to stop Professor X. Move him to buff Kraven. Just so many things you can do with Jeff, and with his stat line, it's a very good stat line for a 2-drop. Shocker is distinctly average. He has a good body, buffs Patriot, it's a cheap card. It's just good. His high Evo ability is okay at best. If it were better, he would be ranked higher, but it's okay, not great. Generally, you probably won't use him for the high Evo. You'd rather use him for the Patriot, but he's also just okay in that, which is why he's in the C tier. Silk, I think, is a good card. It's a 2/5, so it's a good stat line body that you're getting. Better than something like Lizard. And then on top of that, when you replay a card, she can move around, so she can help buff your Kraven. You can buff Angela with it. And yeah, it can get into hard to reach locations, which can also be helpful for you. Generally a good card. Black Swan, we haven't had a lot of time with this version of her. I do think that she is a pretty good card, so I think she's somewhere near the top of the B tier. Her new activate ability puts her at a 2/3, where she can make all the 1-drops free now. It's very strong in bounce and can be good in some niche like Zoo decks as well. I utilized her in a Cerebro 5 deck that was actually really strong. But yeah, it's hard to say exactly how good her ability is now, but it seems to be a pretty strong card. Just the decks that she's in right now aren't the strongest necessarily. But I would say keep an eye on her for when bounce gets that next bounce card coming in a couple weeks, next week maybe. Then she might be on the rise. I think Collector is an above average card, not quite as good as his fellow scalers, but better than Kraven. Like I said, there's just a lot of ways to do it. You have Kate Bishop that's able to do it. You have Swarm that's able to split and help out. And then you have other cards that are just able to generate cards like Coulson, Snow Guard, Helicarrier. When you discard it, can generate cards. So there's a lot of ways to get Collector big. He's not going to get as big as those A tier growers, but he'll still get sizably big, and in some niche decks like discard decks, he can get pretty big, enough to sway a lane in your favor. I think Ravonna is also an S tier card. Just her cost discounting is not as good as ongoing Zabu was, but she is very strong. There's a lot of decks that use her well. The Angela Athena deck uses her extremely well. Most junk decks utilize her well. It's just cost reduction is strong. So, you know, that's any card that gives cost reduction is good. You saw it with Zabu, and we're going to see it with Ravonna as well. Last but not least is Loki. He is now a 2/2. He's only seen in Arashim decks because you can turn one Arashim to completely flip his downside. But he's not good anywhere else. So for that, I'm going to put him at an above average card because the deck he is good in, he's very good in. If you the 15% of the time that you pull him on the right turn, but other than that, he's just an okay card. Just a quick glance over, it looks pretty good to me, so I will say that this is the entire tier list. If you guys enjoyed, let me know what changes you would make, and let me know if you want to see more of this. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next deck highlight.